This is the skills practice for section 5.5. We're going to write a congruent statement for each pair of triangles represented. So basically they're telling you that these triangles are going to be congruent. So they give you congruent segments, and congruent angles. Now just because they listed the congruent angles last doesn't mean that's where they look in the picture. For example, these angles could live in between these sides, and here's how you check that. That's angle C. Notice how both of these segments have a C. So these congruent angles do live in between those congruent sides. Look at this angle O. Is it included? It is. This is side angle side. The congruent angles do live in between those congruent sides. That's how you know. Now they want you to write a congruent statement for this. So triangle ACL is what I'll call the first triangle. We have an AC and we have an L over here, so those three letters are together, triangle ACL. It's congruent to triangle NOP. AC goes with NO. L goes with P. Number 2, they give you congruent segments, and congruent segments. This is side, side, side. These triangles are definitely congruent by side, side, side. There's nothing that you need to check. You don't need to check to see if something is included between two other things. Triangle WXZ is congruent to triangle ABC. WX goes with AB. Z goes with C. In this next section, we're going to determine whether each pair of triangles are congruent. If so, write a congruent statement and explain why the triangles are congruent. So we'll do that first one together there. You have a pair of congruent sides, another pair of congruent sides, and then you have two segments that are perpendicular. Well, we have a theorem that says if those two segments are perpendicular, then both of those angles are 90. So you have congruent angles in between congruent pairs of segments. This is side angle side. That's your explain why. Now the congruent statement is the thing that we just wrote up here. So for example, triangle ABD is going to be congruent to triangle CBD. Number 8, we've got a pair of congruent sides. We've got another pair of congruent sides and a third pair of congruent sides. It doesn't matter if the triangle is rotated or flipped or slid. If you got 3 pairs of congruent sides, they're definitely congruent. You can write that congruent statement on your own. Number 9, that's an example of side angle side. You got 2 pairs of congruent sides, congruent angles included. Number 10 looks a whole lot like number 7. These angles are 90. So you have triangles congruent by side angle side. Number 11, notice how they marked segment PR congruent to itself. They didn't have to do that. You could have done it yourself. You know the reflexive property. These are congruent by side angle, side, side, side. You got 3 pairs of congruent sides. Number 12, we got 2 pairs of congruent sides and congruent angles in between. They didn't have to mark these angles congruent. These are vertical angles. You know they're congruent yourself. So if those marks weren't there, you could put them there yourself. These triangles are congruent by side angle side. Next section. Use the given information to determine whether the 2 triangles are congruent by side angle side. Write yes or no. Well, here's a pair of congruent sides in number 14. Here's a pair of congruent angles. Here's a pair of congruent angles. This is what you end up with here. You have 2 pairs of congruent angles and a pair of congruent sides. That's not side angle side. We're going to talk about this more later. As of right now, our answer to this is no. This is not side angle side. Number 15, we got a pair of congruent segments and another pair of congruent segments. So there's your two S's. And you got a pair of congruent angles. So that's your A. Now, the only other thing you got to check for is you got to see if these congruent angles are included. Is angle O included between these two sides? What letter do both of these sides have? They have L. Angle L is the included angle. So what happens here is you get this. As is not a congruence postulate. You cannot prove that those triangles are congruent.